Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the INCOSE Chesapeake monthly dinner lecture. First off, I want to thank our sponsors, the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, and I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. We have a pretty great speaker, but first I wanted to give you a little bit of the ground rules. So we're going to have Q&A after the speaker's presentation. Because we are streaming live over the web, we will need you to wait to ask your question until you get a microphone. So our speaker tonight is David D. Pietro, and he's spent over 20 years at Goddard Space Flight Center as a lead engineer for advanced systems development, advanced concepts and architectures. Prior to that, he was at NavAir and has a MS and BS in aeronautic engineering, and more importantly, is a retired colonel in the United States Air Force, Hoover Air Force. He's going to be speaking tonight about conducting effective concept design and design to cost trade studies. I had the pleasure of seeing this at the International Symposium in Seattle, and I said, I got to get you to come to Hopkins and speak for our crowd. So without further ado, our speaker, David, thank you.
Well, thank you, Eric and George and Patrick, for inviting me here. And thank you all for being interested in hearing this discussion. First, let me congratulate you on being what I understand is the #1 INCOSE branch in the country. So congratulations. I hope you relaxed and enjoyed this presentation. First, let me ask, how many of you have been involved with concept design? A few of you. How many of you have led a concept design study? A couple. Okay, good. Well, for those of you who have been involved, I think you'll see perhaps some things that you may recognize. And for those of you who haven't, I hope this will give you perhaps some insight into what concept design is about. I'd like to open with a statement and ask if you've heard it before. The best way to control acquisition cost is to get the design right early. Have you heard this? Good. I was at a DoD acquisition, I should say systems engineering conference about 2 years ago, National Defense Industry Association. And I think I must have heard that 25 times in 3 days. And I thought, this is great. If I had to say one thing about controlling acquisition cost, that would be it. But how do you know when you've got the design right? Especially when you're doing something brand new. That's what we'll talk about tonight. And as we do, think about projects that you've seen that have had cost overruns. And how did that happen? Our door prize tonight is a book on the space station. And embedded in that book is a similar story. And I think it's a very good rendition, and I highly recommend it. NASA commissions people to write histories, and this one was written by one of the people who was commissioned to write the history for the early space station program. And that was the Space Station Freedom Program. Okay, so again, I hope you enjoy the talk, and I will proceed. Okay, my briefing is entitled Techniques for Conducting Effective Concept Design and Design to Cost Trade Studies. And as Eric mentioned, this is a representation of what I presented at the International Symposium in July. And it summarizes the contents of the paper that was published by INCOSE for that conference. Okay, so what we'll talk about here today is some of the more strategic aspects of conducting concept design studies. And it actually began as an attempt to help Goddard talk more collectively about concept design, because one organization views it one way, another organization views it another way. And when you're a systems engineer, you've got to run teams with multiple organizations. So it helps if they all have a common perspective. So we'll talk about what concept design is and why it's important. What fidelity do you need in the design solution? And then we'll talk about techniques in designing the mission level trade space and challenges in determining credible design convergence. And we'll finish with some recommended practices. So first, it's important to note that concept design can be conducted many different ways. This is just one method for conducting concept design, but it is particularly suited to immature mission concepts that advance the state of the art and that have high design uncertainty. I'm going to come back to that phrase many times. I'll just call it these kinds of projects or these kinds of programs. We'll be using a space observatory example to talk through this. So when you see this phrase, think first of a kind, cutting edge technology. That's what this kind of process is good for. All right, so what is concept design and why is it important? It's an exploratory process that's conducted to provide a feasible system-level design baseline for a new concept. Now, I'll come back to that word feasible in a moment. It's as much an investigation of requirements as it is of design. And it involves a concurrent investigation of a number of things, including ConOps, requirements, design, performance, technology development, verification, flight dynamics, ground systems, etc. And it happens in the first two phases of the project lifecycle. This is the NASA project lifecycle and an abbreviated form of it. And pre-phase A and phase A are the two phases where concept design is conducted. Then that's followed by preliminary design in phase B, and then final design and fabrication the way NASA currently has its lifecycle structured. And following that is phase D, that's assembly, integration, and test. So some of the key reviews in the concept design phase, in the design phases are mission concept review at the end of pre-phase A. Then there's the system requirements review and mission definition review at the end of phase A. And then preliminary design review at the end of phase B. And in the middle of phase C, we have critical design review. Now, as I mentioned, assembly and integration and test happens here. So between CDR and the end of phase C, that's where fabrication occurs. So at the end of phase C, you've got hardware in hand. So we'll come back to that point as we talk through this. Okay, so concept design plays a central role in project success because its product effectively locks or renders unchangeable the majority of system lifecycle cost. Now that's extraordinary leverage, and it presents a business case for conducting concept design in a rigorous and pragmatic fashion, particularly for the kinds of projects we're talking about here. First of a kind, cutting edge technology. This is a conceptual depiction from Strategy Bridge Corporation, and it shows roughly the life cycle phases on the horizontal axis and percent project funds expended on the vertical axis. And you can see by the time you get to your concept decision point, you've expended very little of your life cycle costs, but you've locked in the majority of your life cycle cost with your system level design. So, done well, concept design provides an executable system-level baseline for project teams in phase B and later phases. Not done well, it can subject those teams to system-level redesign, and in some cases, multiple system-level redesigns that are accompanied by a host of things that you don't want to have happen. Things like fluid technical baselines with ever-decreasing capabilities, cost overruns, recurring schedule delays, contract disputes and cancellations, and difficulty keeping trained people. Phase A and pre-phase A offer a unique venue to do this kind of work. Teams are small, they're agile, and they're closely coordinated. They typically operate absent many of the formalities in phase B and later phases. For example, typically there are no prime contracts, and system level requirements aren't under configuration control typically until the end of phase A, phase A. And so that allows teams to accommodate a relatively high rate of change in system level requirements and design characteristics. I'll abbreviate that R&DC for short. And that helps enable a broad investigation of a trade space in a relatively short time. Now, when I talk about requirements in quotes, what I'm referring to are interim reference capabilities used to guide the point designs in the trade space. Strictly, system level requirements aren't baselined until SRR. And that will be for a final concept design that's converged to meet technical and programmatic, including cost and schedule constraints. Okay, so conversely, phase B and later phases are not well suited to conduct concept design. In phase B, the system level design is more difficult and more expensive to change. Teams are typically larger and more distributed. Prime contracts are typically in place, and the system level requirements typically are under configuration control, and preliminary design work assumes the system level design work has been completed. In phases C and D, things get even worse. Teams are typically even larger, and both system and subsystem level requirements typically are under configuration control, and detailed design work either is underway or has been completed. So that's a little background on why concept design is important. Now we'll talk a little about the fidelity needed in the design solution. So this gets to how good is good enough. How do you know when you're finished? So returning now to that term feasible. The term feasible is used frequently in the concept design phase, but its use is often problematic because it's often not defined and it's left subject to interpretation. In this presentation, I'll use feasible to mean the following: technical, cost, and schedule characteristics for a single baseline mission concept design have been credibly converged to the first order by the end of phase A, such that the design may be developed, launched, operated, and decommissioned by a competent project team starting in phase B within customary technical and programmatic margins. Where credible convergence to the first order means system level sizing and performance, I'll use SLSP for that acronym, of mission elements is confidently determined to within 90% of the SLSP when the flight system is delivered. That means SLSP could change by plus or minus 10% between the end of phase A and launch. Have I done something? There we are. Okay, so what does that look like? We have in this figure the project phases, and I'm showing the end of the project phase. So this is the end of phase A, the end of phase B, and the end of phase C. And here we've got system level sizing and performance error in percent. Now, when you think of this parameter, think of something like system level power or system level dry mass. So by the end of phase A, reading the solid black curve, the system level dry mass or power should, the estimate of power or dry mass should be known to within plus or minus 10%. By the time you get to the end of phase B, you should know it to within plus or minus 1%. And then by the end of phase C, plus or minus 0.1%. And remember, CDR is here and fabrication is right here. So you have hardware in hand by the time you finish phase C. So your estimates ought to be quite good. Okay, so again, at the end of phase A, your first order converged or converged to 90%. Read that as 9 times 10 to the 1, or accurate to 1 significant digit, plus or minus 10% error. By the time you get to phase C, your third order converged, or 99.9% converged, and accurate to 3 digits, or plus or minus 0.1% error. Now, these are approximate guidelines only. It's a course model that depicts an idealized trend of fidelity in each phase, and it assumes that the calculations are done properly, but simply with either incomplete or incorrect information. Okay, so for example, if you had a 4,000 kilogram space observatory, the system level mass should be known to plus or minus 400 kilograms at the end of phase A, and that gets better to, by the end of phase C, to plus or minus 4 kilograms. And we've talked about, no, we didn't talk about that. I'm going to back up slightly, and I will tell you also that this convergence, we talked about the solid black line here, and I should mention that convergence is not always uniform, as you probably have encountered. Sometimes it is non-uniform. All of this convergence here needs to happen within the envelope of whatever design rules your organization levies. At Goddard, for example, we're told that power and dry mass at the end of phase A has to carry a 25% margin on it. And at the end of phase B, 20% at the end of phase C, 15%. So this is an envelope that everything has to happen within. All right, so why is that important to you? Imagine you're a project manager and it's the beginning of phase B. So you're holding a 25% margin for mass and power, for resources. You can accommodate a concept design that's been credibly converged to 90% or within plus or minus 10% error for flight sizing and performance values, even if the 10% error all occurs in the increased direction because you're holding a 25% margin. But you can't accommodate a design that's been converged to within only plus or minus 30% because you're only holding 25. In that case, if the error all goes in the direction of needing increased resources, you're likely to need a D-scope. Okay, so that's a little discussion about the fidelity and how good is good enough. What fidelity do you need at the end of concept design? Now we'll talk about techniques for designing the mission level trade space. Okay, so this is a trade space terrarium, which I've used at Goddard on a few occasions. And down here we've got, on the horizontal axis, we've got mission lifecycle cost from low to high. On the vertical, technical capability from low to high, and going into the board development schedule from short to long. You'll see two red lines. These are both constraints. So you may be given a cost constraint, and you may be given a schedule constraint in an RFP, request for proposal, or something. And so you might say, you might get a requirement, don't exceed $300 million for your mission, including the launch vehicle. That's a cost constraint. You may be told no greater than 36 months between the start of phase B and launch. Both of these things will factor into your planning and into your design as you're working through the concept design phase. Now, you see 3 points in this space, an A, a B, and a C. Okay, so point A is a realistic desired capability. This is often the point that the customer will walk in with. The customer may be a scientist, it may be a technologist, and this is usually what the scientist has as a vision. Now, it typically also is shown later to exceed the cost constraint and exceed the schedule constraint. But that's not necessarily obvious at the outset, but typically it does turn out this way. Point B, on the other hand, is the science or technology floor. Now, this is the point below which the mission is no longer compelling. It's no longer worth doing. You've dropped the technology level or the technical capability so low that it's already been done before. It's not worth spending the money on. Okay, now point C lies somewhere in between, and you don't know where that is. The objective is to find it in minimum time. So if you run the A point first, you run the B point second, you'll interpolate to find the capability of the C design, and you'll push the technical capability up as high as you can, just so the C design just touches the cost constraint and back here touches the schedule constraint. So that's the basic idea. Now, when I work with teams at Goddard, just to make this easy, I refer to this design as a Yugo, that one is a Chevy, and that one is a Cadillac. Okay, so we got the Yugo, the Chevy, and the Cadillac. Remember the Yugo? Yeah? Okay. It gives a nice visual. Okay, so this is more like a route finding algorithm than it is like the successive refinement design processes typically used in phases B and C. In phases B and C, each design typically is a refinement of the system level design from the prior phase. In the process we're talking about here, typically there isn't a baseline design until the concept design is complete. That's an important point, and sometimes it's difficult for people who've worked mostly in phase C, phase D, who come in, they rotate in onto a concept design team, and they want to see a baseline. In this case, in order to get across the trade space and converge in minimum time, we're actually hopping from a Cadillac to a Yugo, and then we're interpolating to get there as quick as we can. So this process is purposely viewing the design problem from multiple perspectives. And that's done to have the team look in places that otherwise might not have looked before. And that illuminates aspects that otherwise may have remained hidden. That helps stimulate creative thinking, mitigate biases, and it also helps drive out unknown unknowns, things that you simply don't know are out there. You won't know until you go look. Okay, so selecting bounding cases, of course, then is important. If you're trying to interpolate to find your Chevy, it's important to bound the solution space. Now, if you don't manage to select bounding cases for this, that could cause extrapolation to find your C design. Okay, now that could happen if, for example, both the A and B designs turned out to exceed the cost and schedule constraints. Okay, so imagine, for example, that the customer wanted a Cadillac, and then the second design, a Cadillac without an ashtray, right? Okay, so where does that leave you? It leaves you with two high-end points, and you've got to get into, both are exceeding the cost and schedule, and you've got, with one more design, you've got to get into the cost box because maybe you have to deliver a proposal by a certain time. So what that indicates is the requirements and design characteristics for the B design didn't identify the true science or technology floor. Now that can happen. In some cases, this can be an emotional thing for the customer. The customer just cannot see him or herself driving a Yugo, even test driving a Yugo. Okay, and I'm bringing this up because some of this, as systems engineers, when you run a concept design team, these are things that you need to know ahead of time so you can plan to try and avoid them. If you have two designs that exceed the cost and schedule constraints, and you've only got time to run one, it may put you in a situation where you need to run an additional design cycle to bracket the solution space. Now, the deadline may not permit that. You may have a proposal due on a particular date, or it could wind up driving significant team overtime. And that's why this is part of a strategic discussion. Because when you get together with your organizations and you plan for one of these activities, you're planned with a certain level of staff resources, and as a team lead, it's up to the team lead to help shepherd the team through that within the resources available. Okay, so I'm going to tell you that optimistic A designs and false science floors for the B designs are common. Okay, this is in fact it's typical. Okay, the customer's vision often isn't cost or schedule constrained. Secondly, the customer may resist identifying the true science or technology floor for the reasons I just mentioned, or the customer may be concerned that if you give the design team the B design, the team may say, gee, we're within the cost and schedule constraints, we're finished. And the customer says, but I don't have the capability I'd like. So for more than one reason, the customer may resist giving you the true science floor. So it's important for teams to recognize and adapt to these considerations. Those that do pragmatically and quickly tend to fare better than teams that don't. Okay, so in this approach, in most cases, the parameters will reflect a high-end design for the A design, the science or technology floor for the B design, and somewhere in between for the C design. But it doesn't have to be that way all the time. Your B design, the Yugo, can contain a Cadillac grille, for example. It can, but there needs to be a reason to do that. It's not there just because you like the Cadillac grille. There has to be some instructive point behind doing that. Similarly, the C design can contain not just Chevy parts, it can contain a Cadillac grille, Yugo seats, and some Chevy parts, just so it all balances out in cost and schedule space. Now, after you've run the A design, if you run the A design first, the R&D-C for the B design is reevaluated to make sure that you have bounded the solution space. One observation is, as you're doing these design studies, if you have only 3 cycles, you have to vary many parameters at the same time, maybe 20, 25 design and requirements type parameters at the same time. So it's a fair question to ask, how can you understand the sensitivities of one parameter to another when you're changing so many at the same time? The good news is the experience at Goddard shows that teams can sufficiently, not perfectly, but sufficiently understand the parameter sensitivities in this type of trade study process. That's something I didn't believe the first time we went through it, but historically it's turned out to work well. Okay, so now we'll talk about, well, I should say, with that kind of construct, it seems straightforward then to how you're going to figure out what your C design is. You just have an A design, a B design, and you bracket and you determine your C design. Well, it turns out in practice there are many challenges in determining the credible design convergence, and we'll talk through those here. Concept design is inherently exploratory with relatively high uncertainty. Teams are learning at a high rate, and conclusions may be invalidated by later findings or by unknown unknowns that came up as a result of just doing the design process itself. Yet the teams do, and managers do, they still would like to have indicators to tell you when the design is complete. Short or excluding, you don't want to be tied to things like this. You don't want to say that we're finished with our studies simply because we ran out of money or time, right? You don't want to be, you don't want to say we finished our study because we have pressure to meet a milestone deliverable, or because of biases, or simply due to insufficient rigor. None of these is a good reason to say that you're finished with your concept design, because that may kick the can down the road into phase B, and then you've got to go work on it in phases that are not well structured to do this, and they're more expensive and more difficult to do this kind of work in. Okay, so back to our terrarium again. And it's the same terrarium, okay? The only thing I've done is I've added 3 points, an A sub B, an A sub C, and a B sub C point. Okay, so let's imagine that you've just run your A design, and you finish it, and you spot this point in the solution space. So your A design has this cost, and it has this schedule. Then you go off and run the B design. And you learn some things when you run the B design, inevitably. And when you run the B design, you say, gee, if I'd only known that in the A design, my A design cost would have been a little higher, and it would have taken a little bit longer to develop for a given technical capability. Okay? So now you go off and run the C design. Same thing happens. You learn some more things, and you say, gee, if I'd only known that on the B design, it would have been a little more expensive, and it would have taken longer to develop for a given technical capability, and that would have rippled back into the A design, and it would have brought the A design point further to the right in cost and further back in schedule. What you're seeing here is a Cadillac which is on its way to becoming a Bentley. Okay? Now, in some cases, this can be a pronounced movement, especially on these kinds of missions that we're talking about. Very technically aggressive missions. And when that happens, it can sweep the B design out of this position and shove it to the right of the cost constraint and back behind the schedule constraint. So you can wind up with an A design and a B design, both of which exceed the cost and schedule constraints. Okay, now that could happen for one of two reasons. Either the B design was a false science or technology floor, or it could be that the design simply is unstable. It cannot converge. You're trying to put 10 pounds in a 5-pound box, and when you do the design work and find out you can't afford it, it's telling you something. You really can't afford it. Okay, this is a common characteristic, by the way, of these kinds of projects. And usually, when you hit the C cycle, when you're in the C cycle, you have come far enough when you've finished the C design, you've come far enough down the learning curve that the learning tends to taper off for most designs. Okay, sometimes a D cycle is needed, or it may be planned from the outset. But for the most part, when you finish your C design, if you've done due diligence, you've got most of your learning behind you. Okay, so a little about the WBS. This was a subtle point that came out of a mission that we conducted about 10 years ago. And we used a grassroots cost estimate for this pre-phase A mission concept. Normally that's reserved for phase A, but we did it in pre-phase A. And it was a very complex mission. So we did a grassroots cost estimate, and that involves a relatively detailed WBS, a work breakdown structure. Now, the WBS dictionary for most space mission elements is relatively well known and largely existing. So, for example, for the spacecraft, the launch, the ground system, those are pretty well fixed. The WBS for a spacecraft, mechanical, power, thermal, attitude control, we know that. We know what that is. In a power system, if you go down one level, power generation, power storage, power distribution. That's known. But when you're creating a WBS for a new instrument, an instrument that you've created out of whole cloth on a whiteboard with a team of scientists and engineers, the WBS is effectively being created right along with it, okay? So it is design dependent, and it evolves as the instrument design evolves. Now, if the instrument is the dominant element of your design, let's say you've got a very, very large, very complex instrument that dwarfs the size of the bus on the observatory, then it's important to understand that the uncertainty in the instrument may dominate the uncertainty in the mission cost. Okay, so multiple cost cycles typically are needed to develop a WBS free of significant gaps and overlaps. Anybody, if you've put together a WBS, I think you'll understand that that involves partitioning component X, component Y, and accounting for things once and only once. And sometimes when you're doing things that are brand new, it takes a few cycles to get that ironed out. Okay, so the cost fidelity improves with the understanding both of the design and of the WBS. All right, so one subjective criterion for whether credible convergence has been achieved is whether the team has experienced significant surprises. Now, if you've gone through this process and you haven't experienced at least a few significant surprises, you should be cautious of your results. A lack of surprises may indicate you haven't progressed sufficiently down the learning curve, or the team didn't sufficiently exercise the trade space or mitigate biases. You've got the Cadillac, and you've got the Cadillac without the ashtray, and you're wanting to believe that the cost is going to converge. Or simply the study objective wasn't sufficiently challenging. For example, if you're just doing a block upgrade to a satellite that's already flown and you're only changing 10% of the satellite, you don't need this process for that. Okay, so that talks a little bit about the challenges involved in determining credible convergence. So with that, we'll talk about some recommended practices and wrap up. Okay, first practice is treat your design cycles as a precious resource. They're silver bullets. They're essential but in limited supply due to the time and resources available. Focus the team efforts on developing the product and actively omit peripheral tasks. Don't try to retrofit the A and B designs with information you've learned in later cycles. Just apply what you've learned to subsequent design cycles. There usually isn't time to do the retrofitting, and it really isn't necessary. However, it is good to bookkeep the changes between the designs, because sometimes that is helpful in scaling one design to another. And inevitably, you'll have a discussion or two about those kinds of things. Then, don't let your first cost estimate be your final cost estimate. Be cautious of early results. They may not be as they initially appear. Just like we looked in the trade space can fool you. Okay, and then document your designs in reports at the end of each cycle. Reports, not briefings. Let the reports be the documents of record. Once you have a report, a briefing can be generated with very minimal effort. And there are a number of reasons to do this. They're in the backup slides and in the paper. Okay, and then three more I'll talk about individually here. The first is maintain first order level of analysis depth in concept design. Now, pre-phase A and phase A teams are looking at multiple designs across a broad trade space in a short amount of time. So the analysis tools need to be first order precision. They need to be agile enough to adapt to frequent and significant changes. So your analogy here might be a hacksaw. Okay, think of a hacksaw. By comparison, the tools in phase B, well, let me give a visual for that. Imagine that you're in your garage and you're trying to figure out, you've got 5 different designs for a box that you're trying to figure out, and you can't figure it out unless you actually try it. So you take the hacksaw out and you carve out the boxes, and you say, okay, I like box number 2 and box number 1, 3, 4, and 5. I'll set those over here. They're going to go in the trash. I don't want to use them anymore. But I'll work more on box 2. Well, in phase B, the tools are second order precision. They assume the system level design is stable, okay? So in this case, the analogy here is a file. You might want to continue working on that box, taking off some of the rough edges. In phase C, the tools are of third order precision, and they assume both the system and subsystem level designs are stable. The analogy here is a polisher, okay? So now, if you're ever found in phase C with a hacksaw in your hand, you've done something wrong. Okay, what it means is you didn't credibly converge your first order design by the end of phase A, and you're having to do system level concept design work late and out of sequence. Okay? Similarly, a team found using a polisher in phase A is doing something wrong, because you'll never move quickly or broadly enough across the solution space to rough out and credibly converge the first order solution. Besides, some of the design elements may not even exist in the final design. Those other boxes we threw out, why polish those? It's time wasted. I'm bringing this up because sometimes you have these discussions. There are people who work principally in phase C and in phase D. They're used to doing the details. When they get recycled into a phase A team, pre-phase A team, they bring that with them. And so you have to have this discussion. And sometimes it takes a few discussions. Okay, second is avoid significant rounding errors. Rounding errors can significantly affect the margin determination that we looked at back in figure 3, the 25% that you need at the beginning of phase B, for example. In some cases, rounding errors can fully mask the margins, as we showed in figure 3. So, and I have an example of that in the backup charts if you'd like to see it, and it's also in the paper. So to avoid masking these resource margins, if knowing that 25% is really there is important to you, and it should be, bookkeep your design and performance calculations to 3 significant digits as a minimum and report out to 2. Now, before you jump on me, okay, I'm not saying that there is 3-digit accuracy in the concept design solution. As we've been talking about, there usually is not. This is simply a numerical safeguard to avoid propagating rounding errors to the point where they can overwhelm the ability to determine your margins. Finally, recognize the 4 unofficial but typical phases of concept design. Okay? And there are 4. The first phase is unbridled optimism. Now, this phase would be, for example, team is sitting around the table here, and they're all talking about the new project, and they're talking about how wonderful the mission is, how good the science is. If it's a proposal, they may say, oh, it has the best chance to win. This is a discussion you might be having. And requirements might be considered, but they're being considered in a somewhat not cost-constrained fashion. Okay? Then phase 2. Phase 2 is a brief phase, shock. Okay? And this phase usually begins after the team completes its first credible cost estimate. Okay? That's followed very quickly by phase 3, denial. Now, this can be a protracted phase. Okay? And it features abundant rationalizations as to why the models used to assess cost were wrong. Okay? And then teams, for example, might also point to anything except the excessively high technical capability as to why the costs are so high. Ultimately, finally, most teams come to phase 4 acceptance. And this is where the team ultimately realizes it's got to reduce technical capability in order to get into the cost and schedule box. The takeaway here is the quicker that a team moves through phases 1, 2, 3 and gets to phase 4, the better that team will fare. Okay, closing thoughts. Concept design phases have extraordinary leverage over project success. There's a business case to conduct them in a rigorous and pragmatic fashion, particularly for these kinds of first-of-a-kind, cutting-edge technology missions. They provide a unique venue to explore and converge system-level design. Done well, concept design can provide an executable system-level baseline for phase B and later phases. Not done well, some of the work of the concept design phases will have to be done again. And the later that realization occurs, the more expensive the resulting redesign is likely to be. And that concludes my talk. Thank you very much.
Okay, let me remind you before we start the Q&A, wait for a microphone to come your way as well. Before we get started, raise your hand if you haven't received the blue ticket, please, and our colleague will come around and give you one. Any questions here?
Great talk, David. Thank you. I've been at NASA on and off for 20 years myself, and I wonder if you can talk to some of the major issues, perhaps with James Webb or other programs, where they did spend, or at least appeared to have spent, a significant amount of time in conceptual design. Are there approaches that they missed, or just some lessons learned, maybe?
Well, I can't address JWST directly, but as Eric was just holding the book here, Space Station was a good example. I spent 4 years on the space station, and the book here explains reasons why the project moved forward when it wasn't entirely converged and ready to move forward. So some of those can be simply political reasons. You can imagine Space Station intensely political. And as I recall, the book indicates that the program was sold to the president for, if I recall correctly, it was $17 billion, and the administrator knew at the time it was $8 billion. So some of it can be political, some of it can be technical.
Can you work some of those political factors into the conceptual design phase so that you have perhaps some more flexibility for varying positions and you can make some decisions later? How would you work with that? Because that happens all the time.
I'm sorry, can we work those into the design phase?
Into the conceptual, can you add some of the political pressures or the expected political pressures into, can you bring them into consideration in the conceptual design phase and figure out how to mitigate that risk?
That would be ideal. That's always the objective if you're doing this right. But you can imagine on a program like a space station, which has constituencies in many states, has constituencies in Congress, it can get pretty challenging to fight the political aspect of this. The system engineer's job is to be the conscience of the team. The system engineer is looking at the objective results and saying, it is not converged to my satisfaction. If it's something that you've been working on, if it's something that's cutting edge technology and you've never done it before, that's when you need to take some extra time and make sure you're comfortable with it. Now, you really can never know absolutely that you are converged, but you, as I mentioned before, if you haven't been surprised a few times, you really ought to question your results, because this is a process that you'll feel like you've been through the wash and spin cycle when you're finished. You should. You should feel like you've really got your sleeves rolled up and your hands dirty. If it's just like a walk in the park, something is missing, and something is probably lurking over the next hill that has to be attended to.
Any other questions?
Thank you. Just having done this a little bit myself, one of the things that always bothered me was, how do I know that I'm within 10%? Because, well, a couple of things. One is, there are the unknown unknowns that are the things that can bite you. They often bite you very badly, as you pointed out. There are the known unknowns that you have distributions on, but again, your knowledge of those distributions are questionable, and the question is, are you going for an 80% confidence or a 50% confidence? And so, again, I'm trying to figure out, how do you know you're good to within 10% and that it's converged down to that 10%?
In an absolute sense, I think it's very difficult to know as you're going forward. Sometimes when you look back, you'll be able to see it, right? And that's why I'm focusing a bit more on some of the, if you feel like you've been surprised, that's one of the indicators. It's a lot like simply turning over rocks. You have to turn over rocks in a systematic fashion to find out where the unknown unknowns are. By definition, you don't know where they are. So you have to take a structured approach to finding, to turning over rocks and finding out if there's something there. And that's why we're having this discussion. But from my experience, we've really never had this kind of convergence discussion. I've never heard it before. And it's always been something that I've been looking for in concept design, even if it isn't absolutely ironclad. Because the other approach would be to say, you often hear, well, I've taken my requirements out of spreadsheet form and I've put them indoors. And that's a measure of how mature my design is. Well, it's just a measure of where the requirements are. They could be just as immature indoors as they are in the spreadsheet. In fact, the spreadsheet can be better than doors. Sometimes we use only the spreadsheets. So it's that kind of discussion that I'd like to move beyond as systems engineers and think more about really how to describe the level of goodness of the product, not the level of artifacts like doors or reports. It's that I'm trying to get at. But you're right, it's difficult to know absolutely that you're at 10%. So I think some of this is simply, after you've been through it many times, you get a sense. Have we really felt like we've been through the ringer on this or not? If it's too quiet, you probably ought to go back and do a bit more.
Any other questions? We have one up front.
Yeah, could you go back to, was it slide 7 or 8 when you showed the phases?
7 or 8.
And then I have a couple of questions. And very excellent, with the slide number is very visible in the bottom left corner. That's always important if people have questions at the end.
Okay.
Yeah, where you have the phases. Yeah, right.
Okay.
Slide 7. So we're spending a lot of time on the left side, from mission and concepts. Now, when you get over to the right side, you also have to look at issues when you're going into system test and the actual testing, and further on, because space station you can always do something about and fly up and repair and upgrade, etc. So I wanted to, I was wondering, when you say dry mass and power, those are very profound terms for launching into space. If you have a better explanation, or is that so profound in your, power and dry mass?
I'm not sure I grasp the question.
You're using the term power and...
Power and dry mass, yes, as examples of system level sizing and performance errors that you're trying to converge. In flight systems, in spacecraft, power and dry mass are very important parameters. And there are examples of things that you really want to have a good handle on as you're going through phase B, C, and you want to be able to prove to yourself that you are within the required margins from your organization. So, and so that those are examples. There are certainly more than those examples, but what question do you have?
Okay, I just want to, that defined. So with all the elements, subsystems, they're all contributing to the minimization of uncertainty as you go along.
Right.
So you can,
Right. Right.
yeah,
So at the beginning, when you're, and this happens in the airplane design world as well, in spacecraft, you're always trying to estimate how much mass is this going to be, for example, and there are techniques to do that, and some of them are based on years of history, and it's an art form in many cases. It's a very important one, and so the degree to which you can estimate mass for aircraft, for example, it's very important to the success of whether a program will succeed in phase B and C. If you come in light in phase A and you allow that to go forward, you can have major weight increases in phase B that cause significant redesigns. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
it defines things better.
Right. Okay. These are estimates that you want to have a good handle on, whatever's important to you, and the degree to which you can estimate them is what I'm trying to show here. The degree to which you should be able to estimate them.
And you're putting this together, with all the subsystems inputs to narrow, the margins.
Right. I mean, at every phase, you're going to have an accounting of all the mass, and the degree to which you understand that mass and the margin that should be on it is going to improve as you move through the life cycle. And as you get hardware in hand, it's going to get much, much better, provided your design is appropriate. If your design is, if you've got a good design point, then that makes sense. If your design point is not well matched, or there's some lurking something you missed in phase A, a big thing, then your mass and power estimates can jump on you.
Any other questions?
Hello, I'm Matt Alexander. I had a question. Are there any technologies or approaches in the last 5 years that really cut down on the uncertainties? So for example, 3D printing or things that allow you to test a concept and have a discussion on it in a more efficient manner?
I'm not sure I can give you any particulars. Model-based system engineering, of course, is being talked about quite a bit here. But again, what goes into those models it's what goes into the models. It's important. On what basis are you making these estimates? So I think it would be ideal if MBSE could come forward and help us with this. And I think if we could reduce our cycle time and run through activities quicker, I think it would be to the good. I think MBSE might show some promise for that, but I think that's still in the future.
One last question. Actually, we have two more.
Yes, using similarity or already qualified products. How common is that in NASA spacecraft?
Using similarity?
Yeah, in the aircraft industry, they'll waive testing because a product or a subassembly has already been qualified and maybe in service.
Right.
And I'm curious about how that fits into the the system here. In other words, I realize that you do all up testing and so on, but in moving between these phases, obviously, if you can use a pre-qualified product, you're going to have it cheaper.
Right. I think at Goddard, similarity is treated with due caution because whether you have the same component may be suitable for one environment, but you take it out of that environment, maybe low Earth orbit, and you try to use it for Mars. The environment may change. So similarity wouldn't hold in that case because the environments aren't the same. So people tend to look very carefully at, do you have the same requirements, the same environment? Is it really similar before they will say, we'll use similarity as a verification approach.
One last question in the back.
Yes. I'm intrigued in some ways, but then I'm exceptionally skeptical in other ways. I didn't get all these gray hairs because I have a son that claimed that he gave them to me. I started out working back in the late 60s when project systems management engineering was first being implemented throughout DoD and even NASA, using special NASA programs, special DoD programs. And it seems like about every 10 years or so, maybe it's 15, we go through and we say, oh, we got to recreate what we're doing. We're not getting to where we want to go and whatnot. And this has been consistent. To the last sense is that for major programs, which also affects NASA programs, but particularly DoD programs and the interworld programs, you had certain people in the Pentagon that said, okay, we're going to do away with cost estimating and analysis and support contractors, sort of, and we're going to rely upon strictly the primes and have the primes bid against each other. Now, that doesn't seem to be working, and that was implemented roughly, began being implemented roughly about 5 years ago. What key success factors need to be co-implemented, be it personnel capabilities, or other things within the system procedurally or otherwise, to make this approach successful, where basically the others have been, at best, marginally successful?
It's a good question, and I think it's a pervasive question because, as you say, DoD has gone back and forth on acquisition approaches over decades, and performance has been not better than it has been in the past. I don't want to get into that side of the discussion, but I think the crux of it, when I think about it, some of the things, for example, DoD has changed its equivalent of NASA's project management approach. DoD has an equivalent project management. I should say it is an acquisition approach, and my observation is that they have tended to change things at the acquisition policy level and expected that to net benefits in life cycle cost. And my observation, or at least my feeling about that, is you need to, there's no substitute for having people that have the skills and the capabilities and keeping those people trained in those skills and capabilities. And in particular, trained in doing something like pre-phase A and phase A, because it has such leverage on the life cycle cost. That's where I would focus. I would put more effort here and have people in the organizations actually doing the work, not contracting it out, but actually doing the work, the design work done right here, sitting around the table with pencil and paper and calculators and whatever you need, but have the team sharp and trained in doing this kind of work, because this is where, if the majority of system lifecycle cost is set here, it seems to me this is where you need to pay attention. If I had to say one thing about it, as I mentioned it earlier, it would be pay attention to phase A and pre-phase A, and have teams who have the resident skills on staff to do that work and do it in-house. Don't contract it out. So I think that's where I'd start. That's what I would say. I don't think you can solve these problems at the acquisition policy level. I think it's really more intrinsic to having the actual, there's no substitute for having good people, trained people.
Before we conclude, I'd like to get another round of applause for our speaker here. Thank you for coming out again, David, and it was just as good the second time around. I appreciate you coming out. And the one thing I did learn tonight is that at first I was thinking, you know, David's got a really big garage. He's got these 3 cars lined up. And then it got even bigger because I started thinking about his workshop in the back, his woodworking table and the hacksaw and the file. Anyway, tonight we gave out tickets. There is a book drawing. Every lecture we do, we give away a book. Tonight's book is The Space Station Decision, Incremental Politics and Technological Choice by Howard McCurdy. The book is always recommended by the speaker, so you should be excited if you win this. So we also have our speaker draw the ticket.
Ah,
David, if you would do us the
Sure.
honor here.
okay.
Okay, get ready. You have your tickets. 9935816. Matt Alexander, the big winner. We haven't seen him for 13 years, and he's come back. No, I'm joking. It's been great having you tonight. Congratulations. Come on up for a picture.